Nobody in Creston Falls thought Miles Harden would survive the first winter after his wife died. Too quiet, too worn down, too ordinary a man to carry something that heavy alone. So when Rochelle Vance, owner of Vance Family Restaurants, 4 locations across the county and a 5th under construction, decided that the old diner on Beulah Street was the last piece of land she needed to complete her corridor plan, she assumed Miles would be easy. He was a 51-year-old widower running a 12-table diner by himself, raising a 9-year-old boy, and barely clearing his bills each month. The kind of man Rochelle had learned to recognize, who could be moved without much force if you applied the pressure in the right places. What she did not know was what Miles had been before Creston Falls, before the grief, before the quiet. Press play right now and find out how one tired father turned a restaurant that was meant to die into the only place in town nobody would ever buy from Rochelle Vance again. Miles Harden woke at 4:45 every morning without needing an alarm. He started the coffee, checked the temperature on the walk-in cooler, and pulled the bread dough he had mixed the night before from the proofing drawer beneath the prep table. By 5:30, the first loaves were in the oven. By 6 he had the soup base going on the back burner. By 6:45, when his son Theo came downstairs from the apartment above the diner, rubbing his eyes and pulling on his shoes at the same time, the whole building smelled like something worth waking up for. Theo was 9, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's habit of thinking carefully before saying anything. He ate breakfast at the counter every morning on the same stool, the one closest to the kitchen pass-through, and he did his homework there every afternoon before the dinner rush. He knew the names of every regular customer and which ones took their coffee black and which ones needed it sweetened before they would speak to another human being. He had learned this the same way he had learned most things, by watching his father, who treated every person who came through the door of the diner as though their time there was the most important part of their day. The diner was called Harden's. It had been on Beulah Street for 11 years, which was how long Miles had owned it, which was exactly as long as he and Ellen had been in Creston Falls. They had driven through the town on their way somewhere else and stopped because Theo, who was not yet born but was making himself known, had decided that Ellen needed food immediately. They had stopped at a diner on Beulah Street that was not yet called Harden's, and the owner, a man named Deke who was tired and ready to be done, had sold it to them for less than it was worth because Miles had been the first person in 2 years to ask. Ellen had said it felt right. Miles had learned in 11 years of being right about almost nothing and her being right about almost everything, to trust that instinct without argument. She had died 14 months ago. A thing that happened quietly and then all at once, the way certain things do, and Miles had not entirely recovered the ability to talk about it in plain terms. He ran the diner, he raised Theo, he made the bread every morning and answered every customer by name and did not discuss what it cost him to keep doing it. The regulars knew. They showed up the way people do in small towns when someone is grieving, not with speeches or casseroles, though there had been some of those in the early weeks, but with presents. They took the same tables they always took. They ordered the same things. They filled the room with the ordinary sounds of ordinary life, and this Miles understood without being able to explain it, was the most useful thing anyone had done for him. Marcus Tully, who had the hardware store 2 doors down, came in every Tuesday and Thursday for lunch. He sat at the corner booth and ate the same thing, a turkey melt with soup, and on the way out he always stopped at the counter and told Miles something small that had happened in his day, something trivial, something that required no response. Miles had understood eventually that this was Marcus's way of saying he was there. The understanding had taken longer than it should have, because Miles was not, in those first months, particularly good at receiving anything. The trouble started on a Wednesday in late March. Miles arrived at the diner at his usual hour and found a notice taped to the front door. It was from the Creston Falls Department of Code Enforcement, dated the day before, citing the diner for a violation he had never heard of: exterior storage of combustible materials within 15 feet of a neighboring structure. He read it twice. There was nothing stored outside his building except a small propane tank in a code-compliant enclosure he had installed 6 years ago and had inspected twice since. He took the notice inside, read it again over coffee, and called the county office when it opened at 8. The woman who answered was apologetic but uninformative. The complaint had been filed anonymously. An inspector would be in contact within 10 days. In the meantime, the notice was informational, not punitive, but if the violation was confirmed, fines could be assessed retroactively from the date of the complaint. Miles set the notice in the drawer beneath the register where he kept documents he needed to deal with and went back to work. He was short-staffed on Wednesdays. He did not have time to stand in a hallway worrying about something that was not, as far as he could tell, based in fact. He found out the same afternoon who had filed the complaint. Marcus came in for lunch and leaned across the counter and said that Rochelle Vance had been making her way through the Beulah Street corridor for the past 18 months, buying up the properties she needed for her expansion plan, and that the only holdouts left were Miles and the couple who ran the dry cleaner 3 doors down. Miles listened. When Marcus finished, he asked whether Rochelle had approached the diner directly. Marcus said she had sent someone, a man named Stanton, who wore a suit and carried a leather folder, and had offered Miles what Marcus described as a number that was technically fair but practically insulting given what the building meant to the family. Miles said he remembered the visit. He had thanked the man, told him the diner was not for sale, and gone back to the kitchen. The man in the suit had seemed genuinely surprised. Miles had not been surprised that he was surprised. Marcus said Rochelle did not handle no well. Miles said that was her difficulty to manage. Marcus looked at him the way people looked at Miles sometimes, as though they were waiting for a reaction that was not coming, and then he ate his turkey melt and did not say anything else. The inspector arrived the following week, a young man with a clipboard who spent 20 minutes examining the propane enclosure, measured its distance from the neighboring wall 3 times, and told Miles it was well within code. He signed off and left. Miles received a written clearance from the county office the following day. 4 days after that, a second notice arrived. This one cited the diner's ventilation system as a potential nuisance violation, generating odors in excess of the permitted threshold for a mixed-use residential and commercial corridor. Miles read this one at the kitchen table upstairs after Theo was in bed with the same coffee cup he had been holding for 40 minutes going cold in his hand. He knew the ventilation system. He had installed it himself with help from a contractor named Ray Dodson 8 years ago. It exceeded the current code standard. He had the documentation. He also knew that documentation was not the point. He sat at the table for a while. Then he went to the shelf in the bedroom where Ellen had kept her cookbooks, and the small wooden box where she stored things she wanted to remember, receipts from places they had been, a note Miles had written her on a napkin on their first trip out of the city, a photograph of the 2 of them standing in front of the diner on the day the sign went up, "New paint," her hand raised, laughing at something he had just said. He did not open the box. He set his hand on top of it for a moment, then went back downstairs and sat in the empty diner and thought. He was not a man given to anger. He had been once in a different life and had spent considerable effort becoming someone else. But he understood, sitting in the quiet of the diner at 11 o'clock at night with the chairs up and the lights low, that what was happening was not an accident and was not going to stop on its own. He called a woman named Paulette Day the next morning. Paulette was a lawyer who handled small business and property matters in the county, and she had been recommended by Marcus, who said she was the kind of person who read the fine print not because she was required to but because she was interested in it. Miles described the 2 notices. Paulette listened without interrupting and then asked 3 questions, each one more specific than the last. When he had answered all 3, she said she would look at the ventilation documentation and get back to him before the end of the week. She called back in 2 days. The ventilation system was compliant. More importantly, she had found something in the municipal records that Miles had not thought to look for. The complaints had been filed by the same entity, a property management company registered in the county that shared an address with Vance Restaurant Group's operational arm. It was not illegal, but it was documented, and documentation, Paulette said, was the beginning of leverage. Miles thanked her and asked her to keep going. She said she would. Theo had noticed that his father was quieter than usual that week. He came into the kitchen on a Friday afternoon after school and sat at the counter and watched Miles prep vegetables for the evening service without asking for anything, which was unusual. After a while, he said that some kid at school had told him the diner was going to be torn down and turned into a parking. Miles set down his knife and looked at his son. He said that was not going to happen. He said it the way he said things he was certain of, which Theo had learned to distinguish from the way he said things he was hopeful about. Theo nodded once. He pulled his homework out of his backpack and spread it across the counter and did not mention it again. A 3rd notice arrived 10 days later. This one came from the county tax office and cited a discrepancy in the commercial property valuation that had resulted, allegedly, in an underpayment of property taxes for the previous assessment year. The amount in question was not enormous, but the notice specified that if the discrepancy was not resolved within 30 days, the account could be flagged for an audit that would freeze any pending business license renewals until the review was complete. Miles's business license was up for renewal in 6 weeks. He read the notice carefully and then called Paulette. Paulette said she would pull the assessment records and compare them against the payments Miles had made. She called back the next morning and said that the discrepancy appeared to stem from a revaluation of the commercial corridor that had been processed 18 months ago, coinciding, she noted, with the beginning of Rochelle Vance's acquisition effort in the same area. The revaluation had been applied inconsistently, and Miles's parcel had been flagged in a way that several neighboring parcels had not. Miles asked whether there was anything actionable in that. Paulette was quiet for a moment, then she said that there was, potentially, though it would take time to establish. She said the more immediate question was whether the tax discrepancy itself was legitimate. Miles told her to find out. She said she would. What Miles did not tell Paulette and did not tell Marcus and did not tell anyone was that he had been doing his own reading. He had been in the restaurant business for 11 years in Creston Falls, and before that for 6 years in Columbus, and before that he had spent 7 years as a commercial real estate analyst at a firm in Chicago called Aldgate Partners. He had left Aldgate Partners when he and Ellen had decided they wanted something that was theirs, something they ran with their hands, something that was not a spreadsheet. He had not used those 7 years much since then except occasionally and quietly and only when he needed to. He needed to now. Vance Restaurant Group's financials were not publicly available in the way that a publicly traded company's would be, but they were not invisible either. Rochelle had taken on a significant commercial development loan from a regional bank called Cornerstone Lending to finance the 5th location. The loan terms, visible in the county permit filings and the commercial real estate transfer records, included a construction completion covenant. The 5th location had to be substantially complete and operational within 24 months of the loan origination date. The loan had originated 20 months ago. Miles wrote this down in a notebook he kept on the nightstand on Ellen's side of the bed, the side he had not slept on since she died and did not sit on except when he needed to think. 4 months was not much time, depending on what was left to complete. He asked Paulette to find out what the permit status was on the Vance 5th location. Paulette called back 3 days later. The construction was behind, not catastrophically but meaningfully. A supplier dispute had delayed the interior build-out by 6 weeks, and the county had issued a conditional certificate of occupancy that required 3 additional inspections before the space could legally open. At current pace, Rochelle was looking at a completion date that was tight against her loan covenant. The parcel on Beulah Street was the last piece she needed for the corridor expansion her projections had promised Cornerstone Lending as part of the long-term business plan accompanying the loan application. Miles sat with this information for 2 days. He did not act quickly, which was a habit, not a limitation. He had learned, over years of operating in kitchens and in markets and in rooms where other people were moving faster, that speed was often a substitute for clarity, and that clarity was what actually mattered. On the 4th day, he called Paulette and asked her to look into whether Cornerstone Lending had shown any movement on its commercial loan portfolio, specifically whether any notes had been placed on a watch list or offered for secondary market sale. Paulette said that was an unusual question. Miles said he had reasons. She called back the following week. Cornerstone had been quietly reviewing its exposure on several large commercial notes following a series of late payments from a cluster of restaurant industry borrowers in the region. The Vance note was not in formal default, but it had been internally flagged. A loan officer Paulette knew through a colleague had confirmed off the record that the bank was open to conversations about reducing its portfolio risk on certain accounts. Miles asked what the discount range might look like on a note of that size. Paulette told him. He wrote the number down. He did not tell Theo about any of this. He told Theo that the notices were being handled, that the diner was not going anywhere, and that the most important thing Theo could do right now was finish his reading assignment and stop letting the kid at school know that he was getting to him. Theo considered this advice, accepted it, and ate his dinner. Later that evening, he drew a picture of the diner from memory, the sign, the window with the geraniums on the sill that his mother had planted and that Miles kept alive with a determination that had nothing to do with plants, and the counter with the stools in a row. He slid it across the table to his father without saying anything. Miles looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully along the center and put it in the pocket of his shirt, over his chest, where it stayed for the rest of the evening. The tax discrepancy was resolved by Paulette within 3 weeks. She found the inconsistency in the assessment methodology, documented it, and filed a formal objection with the county tax authority. The objection was upheld. Miles owed nothing additional and the audit flag was lifted. His business license renewal processed without delay. The ventilation complaint had already been dismissed. The code notice had been cleared. 3 separate actions, each one resolved without public drama, each one documented in Paulette's files and Miles's own. He had also, in the weeks while all of this was moving, done the one thing that none of Rochelle's pressure had interrupted. He had kept the diner open. He had made the bread every morning and the soup every afternoon, and answered every regular by name, and kept Theo's stool at the counter and the geraniums on the windowsill. The room had remained what it was. This had required a particular kind of effort that no one could see and that Miles did not discuss, which was the only kind of effort he had ever been comfortable with. Marcus noticed. He said so one Thursday briefly without sentiment. He said that Miles was the most stubborn person he had ever respected. Miles told him that was a specific compliment and thanked him for it. On a Tuesday afternoon in late May, Miles received a call from a number he did not recognize. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Rochelle Vance. Her voice was careful in the way that a voice becomes when a person is accustomed to controlling conversations and is aware that this one may not go the way she intends. She said she understood there had been some friction around the Beulah Street properties and that she wanted to discuss it directly. She said she was willing to revisit her offer on the diner. Miles listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said he appreciated the call. He said the diner was still not for sale. He said this without apology or ornamentation. Rochelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was curious why he was willing to hold out when the offer was, by any reasonable measure, a fair one. Miles said that fair was a description, not an argument. He said the diner was where his wife had decided to stop when she needed food, and where his son had grown up behind the counter, and that there was no number that changed either of those facts. Rochelle said she understood. She said it like she meant it, which Miles thought she probably did, in the particular way that certain people understand things that they cannot fully account for in their calculations. Then Miles said there was something else he wanted to discuss with her. He told her, directly and without drama, that he had been following the development of her 5th location and was aware of the timeline pressure on her construction covenant with Cornerstone Lending. He said he had been in touch with the bank's portfolio management office through his attorney and that he had made a preliminary inquiry about acquiring the note on the Vance commercial loan at a discount, given the current watch list status of the account. He said this without heat. He said it the way he said everything, level, attentive, with no performance attached to it. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to mean something. Rochelle said finally that she was not sure she understood what he was proposing. Miles said he was not proposing anything yet, he was informing her. He said she had a few weeks before the conversation with Cornerstone became more formal, and that he wanted her to know it was happening so that she had time to consider her position clearly. He said he had no interest in destroying her business. He had an interest in his diner staying where it was, and in making sure the next 18 months on Beulah Street did not look like the last 3. He said if she wanted to talk about what an arrangement might look like, he was available. Then he said he had a lunch service starting in 20 minutes and thanked her for the call. He hung up and went back to the kitchen. The next 3 weeks were quiet in a way that the previous 2 months had not been. No notices, no inspectors, no calls from county offices. Marcus came in on Tuesday and Thursday. Theo did his homework at the counter. The bread rose every morning and the geraniums on the windowsill stayed red. Paulette called on a Wednesday afternoon to say that Rochelle had retained a new attorney and that the new attorney had reached out to discuss a potential resolution. Miles told her to take the meeting. The resolution took 4 meetings over 2 weeks. What emerged from it was not what Rochelle had intended and not what Miles had originally wanted, because neither of them had originally wanted this particular outcome, which was the characteristic of arrangements that actually hold. Rochelle dropped the Beulah Street acquisition entirely. In exchange, Miles withdrew his inquiry to Cornerstone Lending regarding the commercial note. Rochelle received, as part of the arrangement, a right of first offer on the diner property if Miles ever chose to sell, which he told her plainly he did not expect to choose. Rochelle said she understood and signed anyway. There was no public announcement, no press. Paulette filed the paperwork. Miles went back to work. On the Saturday after the agreement was signed, Miles brought Theo into the kitchen before the morning service and showed him how to shape a loaf of bread correctly, how to feel for the right tension in the dough without pressing too hard, how to know by touch rather than by timer when it was ready. Theo had watched him do this hundreds of times. Being taught it was different, he understood that without being told. They worked side by side for an hour. Theo's first loaf came out slightly uneven on one end. He held it up and examined it with the serious look he applied to most things. Miles told him it was a good first loaf. Theo said it wasn't as good as his father's. Miles said that was why it was called a first loaf. Theo put it on the rack with the others and did not argue. Later that afternoon, after the lunch service had cleared and Theo was back at his homework stool, a woman came in who had never been to the diner before. She sat at the counter, ordered coffee and the soup, and looked around the room with the particular attention of someone who is seeing a place for the first time and deciding what to make of it. When she finished, she told Miles that someone had recommended it. She didn't remember who. She said it was the best soup she'd had in a long time. Miles thanked her and refilled her coffee. She left a 20 on the counter for a $12 meal and said she would be back. He watched her go and then turned back to the kitchen, where the afternoon prep was waiting, and the bread from the morning was cooling on the rack, and the geraniums on the windowsill were doing what geraniums do, holding their color against whatever the season brings, without making any particular announcement about it. Rochelle Vance would open her 5th location 11 weeks later, slightly past the covenant deadline, but within the grace period cornerstone extended after the watch list flag was cleared. The corridor on Beulah Street did not become what her expansion plan had imagined. It remained what it was: a hardware store, a dry cleaner, a 12-table diner with a hand-lettered sign and a window full of red geraniums, and a 9-year-old at the counter who could tell you without being asked how you took your coffee. Miles Harden had not moved to Creston Falls with any plan beyond the one Ellen had felt when she needed to stop and eat. He had not opened the diner with ambitions beyond having something that was his and hers and run with their own hands. He had held it through the kind of grief that does not announce itself but sits in every room, in every morning, in the side of the bed you don't sleep on anymore. And when someone had tried to take it from him through pressure and paperwork and the slow accumulation of friction, he had done what he always did. He had gone back to work, he had made the bread, he had kept the room what it was. Theo asked him once, in the weeks after everything had settled, whether he had ever been afraid they would lose the diner. Miles thought about this for a moment, which was his habit with questions that deserved an honest answer. He said there had been moments. He said that afraid wasn't quite the right word. He said it was more that he had understood very clearly what it would mean to lose it, and that understanding had made it simple to decide what he was willing to do. Theo said he thought that was the same as being afraid and handling it. Miles looked at his son. He said that was probably a more accurate description. Theo seemed satisfied. He went back to his homework. That evening, after the diner was closed and the kitchen was cleaned and Theo was asleep upstairs, Miles stood at the counter with the lights low and the chairs up and the whole room quiet around him. He poured himself a cup of the last coffee from the afternoon pot, even though it had been sitting since 3 and was not good anymore, because Ellen had always said that bad late coffee in a diner you loved was better than good coffee anywhere else. He was not sure he would have agreed with that before. He was certain of it now. He drank it slowly, standing at the counter in the room that had been hers first and was now his to keep, and did not rush any part of it.